Somewhere in your DNA right
What in the
now,
world
there is an
is
error.
that?
Not a
It's
poetic
repairing
error.
itself.
Not a metaphor. An actual copying mistake. A small chunk of genetic code that got deleted somewhere in your family's past and was never put back. And if you inherited that mistake from both parents, something strange has been happening to you your entire life. You've been exposed to viruses, bacteria, things that have killed people around you. And for reasons you probably never thought to question, you were fine. Because that mistake doesn't just resist one disease. Researchers have found it resists several, including one that has killed tens of millions of people in the last 50 years. But this mutation didn't come from a laboratory. It didn't come from modern medicine. It didn't come from anywhere scientists expected when they first found it. It came from 1347. It came from the most lethal catastrophe in recorded human history. It came from a disaster so complete, so absolute, so fast that it erased 1 in every 2 people alive in Europe in less than 3 years. The Black Death. Here is the question nobody thinks to ask about one of history's most studied events. If the plague killed half of Europe, why didn't it kill all of it? That answer is buried in your DNA. Before 1347, Europe was alive in a way that's hard to picture now. Not just populated. Connected. The trade routes that ran from Central Asia to the Black Sea, from Constantinople to Sicily, from Venice to the North Sea, they carried silk, spices, wool, grain. They also carried information. News. People. A merchant in Kaffa, a port city on the Black Sea, could trade with someone from Central Asia in the morning and negotiate with a Venetian ship captain by afternoon. This network had taken centuries to build. It was the most sophisticated commercial system the Western world had ever seen. And it was about to become the most efficient killing machine in human history. Here's what medieval people didn't know about the world they lived in. Every rat in every port. Every flea on every rat. Every ship that docked and left. Every merchant who shook someone's hand and moved on. None of that looked dangerous. It all looked like a normal Tuesday. When people got sick, they had explanations. God was angry. The air had gone bad. The stars had aligned wrong. A community had committed some collective sin and the punishment had arrived. Nobody imagined the actual answer. A bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Something invisible to the naked eye. Something that had spent centuries evolving inside rodent populations in Central Asia, quietly, patiently, invisibly, getting better at what it did. And then the trade routes opened a door. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. Most of the sailors on board were already dead. The ones who weren't were covered in black swellings the size of eggs, oozing blood and pus. They were delirious with fever. They couldn't stand. Port authorities took one look at the ships and ordered them out of the harbor immediately. It was already too late. What followed is almost impossible to describe with numbers alone. But the numbers are where you have to start. Sicily, North Africa, Italy, France, Spain, England, Scandinavia, Poland. In less than 3 years, the Black Death crossed an entire continent. Not slowly, not in isolated pockets. Like a wave. Researchers studying death records from this period found statistics that still feel surreal when you read them out loud. In Florence, one of the most sophisticated cities in the medieval world, half the population died within 6 months. Paris lost 1,000 people a day at the peak. The English village of Eyam, when the plague arrived a decade later, made the impossible decision to quarantine itself completely to prevent the spread to neighboring communities. They locked their gates. They accepted their fate. They still lost 2/3 of their residents. Now picture being one of the people still alive inside that village. Your neighbor is dead. You helped carry them to the churchyard 3 days ago. Your priest is dead. The man who had spoken for God in your community since before you were born. The baker whose bread you've bought every week of your life is dead. The midwife who delivered your children. The blacksmith who shod your horses. The tax collector everyone hated but who was at least a known and predictable feature of the world. Gone. 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 And you have no idea why. No framework for understanding what is happening. No word for it. No explanation that holds together for more than a moment before it falls apart. But here's the part that gets overlooked in almost every retelling of this story. In every village that was devastated. In every city that lost half its people. In every house where a family buried most of itself. Somebody didn't die. They were exposed. They lived in the same houses. They breathed the same air. They touched the same surfaces. They buried the same bodies. And they were fine. For over 600 years, nobody could explain this. People assumed survivors had been lucky. That God had chosen them for reasons the chosen couldn't identify. That something in their diet, or their habits, or their constitution had given them a small protective edge. Nobody imagined the answer was already written inside them, in code, before they were born. In 1996, a molecular biologist named Michael Dean was working on something that had nothing to do with the Black Death. He was trying to understand HIV. Specifically, he was trying to understand why some people exposed to HIV repeatedly, consistently, over years, never got infected. HIV is a virus that enters human cells through a specific doorway. A receptor on the surface of white blood cells called CCR5. Without that doorway, HIV can't get in. Dean's team ran the DNA of a population that seemed to be resistant. And they found something that stopped them cold. A small group of people had a mutation in the gene that builds the doorway. Specifically, a 32-letter chunk of code was missing. Just gone. Deleted. The doorway was malformed. HIV couldn't recognize it. Couldn't attach. Couldn't enter. These people were functionally immune to a virus that had killed tens of millions of people. And then the researchers looked at where these people came from. Almost exclusively Northern European descent. England. Scandinavia. Northern Germany. The Netherlands. Precisely the regions hit hardest by the Black Death 650 years earlier. Not a coincidence. Here's what the data suggested. Before 1347, this mutation existed in Europe. Rare. Scattered. Carried by a small number of people who had no idea it was there, doing nothing visible, producing no obvious effect. Then the plague arrived. And the plague Yersinia pestis uses a specific mechanism to attack the human immune system. It hijacks a pathway that runs through something structurally similar to the CCR5 receptor. The people who carried the CCR5 delta 32 mutation had an immune response that didn't behave the same way. The inflammatory cascade that killed most victims, the one that essentially caused the immune system to destroy its own organs in the attempt to fight the infection, didn't fire the same way in them. They got sick. Some of them died. But enough of them survived. And here's what I want you to sit with. They didn't survive because they were smarter, or stronger, or more prepared, or more virtuous, or more loved by God. They survived because of a mistake. A copying error in their DNA, the kind of thing that usually does nothing, or causes harm, happened to break exactly the right door at exactly the right moment. And when everyone around them died, they were the ones left to have children. Those children carried the mutation. Their children carried the mutation. Every generation between 1347 and now, 26 generations of human beings, carried that error forward. Today, roughly 10 to 15% of people with Northern European ancestry carry at least one copy of this mutation. That percentage was much lower before 1347. The Black Death didn't just kill half of Europe. It selected for a specific genetic error and made it common. Every time that mutation appears in a DNA test today, it's a message from 1347. A record of who survived and who didn't. A biological scar from an event that happened 7 centuries ago, still visible. Still active. Still protecting people from diseases the medieval world couldn't have imagined. In 2007, a man named Timothy Ray Brown became the first person in recorded history to be cured of HIV. His doctors didn't use a new drug. They didn't use a new technology. They didn't use anything that had been invented in the modern era. They used a bone marrow transplant from a donor who carried 2 copies of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation. The cure for the most devastating virus of the 20th century came from a genetic copying error that spread through Europe because of the most devastating epidemic of the 14th century. The plague left a tool in the human genome. And 660 years later, that tool cured someone. Here's what the Black Death actually was. Not just a catastrophe. Not just a tragedy. Not just the worst thing that ever happened to the medieval world. A filter. A brutal, indiscriminate, merciless filter that killed without logic, without pattern, without any signal that the people dying could read or understand or prepare for. But at the level of DNA, at the level of copying errors and mutations and selection, it was doing what catastrophe always does to our species. It was finding the survivors. Not because they deserved it. Not because they earned it. Because they carried something the disaster couldn't reach. And now, 7 centuries later, that something is being studied in laboratories around the world. It's being used to design treatments for diseases the medieval world couldn't have named. It's being used to cure a man of HIV. The mistake that saved half of Europe is still saving people today. We are not the descendants of the people who avoided the plague. We are the descendants of the ones who happened to carry a broken gene and found themselves still standing when the dying finally stopped. But here's what happened next. When the Black Death finally burned out, when the dying slowed and the survivors started to look at each other and ask what kind of world was left. The world they saw was unrecognizable. The labor markets had flipped completely. Workers who survived could demand wages nobody had ever offered before. Land that had belonged to the church for centuries sat empty, waiting for whoever was willing to claim it. The religious authority that had explained everything, suffering, death, the will of God, had failed so visibly, so completely, that millions of people who survived the plague stopped waiting for answers from Rome and started looking for answers somewhere else. And into that vacuum, into the silence left by 60 million dead, came something that nobody planned for. An explosion of art. Of science. Of human ambition so concentrated, so total, so unprecedented in its speed, that historians are still arguing about exactly how it happened. Some of them believe the Black Death didn't just reshape Europe. They believe it accidentally started the Renaissance. That's the next episode.